My name is Winifred Duart. I'm 52 years old. I was standing in my mother's living room, holding a tin star ornament so hard the points were biting into my palm, and she looked at me over the rim of her wine glass and said, in front of 11 people, that I had always been the disappointing one, the plain one, the one who never amounted to anything worth bragging about at the club. Nobody moved. Somebody's fork stopped halfway to their mouth. What none of them knew, including my mother, was that I was the reason she had a club membership at all. I was the trustee of the fund that paid for her condo, her car service, her country club dues, her hairdresser, her wine, $14,200 a month every month for 6 years, out of a trust my father left with my name on the discretion clause and nobody else's. She didn't know that. She thought the money simply arrived, the way weather arrives. I felt the cold edge of that little tin star cut into my hand and I didn't say a word back. I just smiled and I set the ornament down very carefully on the mantel like I was setting down something else instead. I want you to picture where you are right now while I tell you the rest of this. What time is it where you're sitting? Is it cold outside your window or warm? Tell me in the comments, because where I was, it was 11:40 at night and it had just started to snow, and I remember thinking, she doesn't know it yet, but this is the last Christmas that gets to feel like this. I grew up the middle child in a family that ran on a very specific currency, and it wasn't money, not at first, it was approval, doled out by my mother in small, calculated portions, mostly to my older brother Theo. My father, Warren, was an engineer, a quiet man who built things with his hands and trusted numbers more than people. And when he died 8 years ago, he left behind something almost nobody in the family understood. A discretionary trust funded well beyond what anyone realized, meant to support my mother's lifestyle for the rest of her life, administered by a trustee with sole legal discretion over how much got paid out and when. He named me. Not Theo, me. I think even then he knew something about how the money would get handled if it went the other way. The family dynamic was simple on the surface and complicated underneath. Theo was the golden one, good-looking, good at golf, married into a family with a boat, and I was the one who showed up with casseroles and got thanked with a comment about my weight. My mother, Marguerite, ran her house the way she ran every room she walked into, with a napkin dabbed at the corner of her mouth even when she hadn't taken a bite. A small, precise gesture she used like punctuation whenever she wanted you to know she found something distasteful. She did it now, dabbing at nothing, looking at me over that wine glass. Here's the thing nobody in that room understood about the trust, and it's the thing that's going to matter later, so hold on to it. My father's document had a clause, Article 7, Section 3, the trustee discretion clause, that let the trustee, me, increase, decrease, or terminate discretionary distributions at any time, for any reason, without needing anyone's permission or explanation. My mother's $40,000 a year country club membership, her 3-bedroom unit at a building called the Aldermere, her twice-weekly car service, all of it flowed through a decision I made every single month to keep signing the checks. Nobody at that Christmas table knew that except me, and though I didn't know it yet, my brother's accountant. Something had already started to feel wrong about 6 weeks before that Christmas, and I want to tell you about it now because it matters more than it seemed to at the time. I'd gotten a call from the trust's outside accountant, a soft-spoken man named Nathaniel Cho who'd managed my father's books for over a decade, asking if I'd recently approved an increase to the property management line. I hadn't approved anything. I told him so. He said a little too quickly that it must have been a clerical error on his end, and he'd sort it out. I remember standing in my kitchen holding the phone a beat too long after he hung up, because Nathaniel Cho did not make clerical errors. Not in 10 years. My flaw, if I'm honest with you, is that I let things slide. I had spent 30 years absorbing my mother's comments the way you absorb weather. You don't fight the rain, you just get wet and go inside. I told myself keeping the peace was a kind of strength. It took me a long time to understand that keeping the peace and being quietly erased are not the same thing, even though for years I couldn't tell the difference standing inside my own life. By the time Theo took over helping Mom with the household paperwork, 2 years after Dad died, I'd already started noticing things: an invoice here, a reimbursement request there, small enough that I signed off without really reading them, because Theo had always been better at that kind of thing than me, or so I'd been told my whole life. I didn't know yet that better at that kind of thing was doing a lot of work in that sentence. There was a night, maybe 8 months before that Christmas, when my mother called me at 10 at night just to tell me that a woman at her club had asked if I was the sister who does something with computers, and she'd laughed about it to the whole table. She wasn't cruel about it exactly. She never was exactly. It was always delivered soft, almost affectionate, which was somehow worse. A warning wrapped in a compliment, the kind you don't recognize as a warning until much later, lying awake, replaying it. If you want to understand where my mother's cruelty actually came from, you have to go back further than either of us lived. In 1958, when she was 11 years old, her own mother was turned away from a luncheon at a country club in a borrowed coat that didn't quite fit, in front of women she'd spent months trying to impress, and my mother stood in the doorway and watched it happen. I only pieced this together years later from an aunt who let it slip at a funeral, but once I heard it, I understood my mother completely for the first time in my life. She had spent 70 years making absolutely certain that no one would ever again see a Duarte woman turned away from anything, and the price of that certainty, paid in full every single time, was whichever one of us she decided at that moment didn't measure up. That understanding didn't make the wine glass hurt less, but it did something else. It made the plan I hadn't even fully admitted to myself feel less like revenge and more like arithmetic. I want to be honest with you. Some part of this whole situation is almost funny, in the way that only real life manages to be. I had spent 6 years secretly bankrolling a woman's entire luxury retirement while she told strangers I did something with computers. And it took her calling me worthless at Christmas, over a store-bought pie, for me to finally read the one document that had been sitting in my own filing cabinet the whole time, with my own name on it, granting me all the power I never once thought to use. The last thing I did before I left that house that night was pick the tin star back up off the mantel and put it in my coat pocket. Nobody saw me do it. I didn't know yet exactly what I was going to do with the trust. I only knew I was done asking myself whether I deserved to use the power my father had already given me. The scene itself, if I back up and give it to you properly, started an hour before the wine glass moment, with the smell of my mother's dining room, clove and orange peel from a candle she lit every year, wool coats drying by the door, the particular cold that comes off a window even when the heating's running. There were 11 of us crowded around a table meant for 8. My husband, Theo, and his wife, my mother's oldest friend Petra Lindqvist, a scattering of cousins, and my mother at the head, dabbing at her mouth with that napkin before anyone had even served the first course. Petra Lindqvist had known my mother since they were both 22, and she'd absorbed my mother's opinions so thoroughly over the decades that she delivered them now as if they were her own discoveries. It was Petra who started it, actually, leaning toward me with a smile that never once reached her eyes and asking, in front of the whole table, whether I'd finally found something to do since my last consulting contract ended, in a tone that made something to do sound like a diagnosis. I felt my face go hot. I said something about a new project, vague, and I watched my mother's mouth curl at the edges, satisfied like Petra had done her a favor. That was the calm cruelty, reasonable sounding, almost concerned, delivered with a little laugh so that if I objected, I'd be the one who couldn't take a joke. My mother didn't raise her voice once. She never has to. She just waited until the table had gone quiet in that particular way rooms go quiet before something bad, and said the thing about me being the disappointing one, the plain one, the one who never amounted to anything worth bragging about, and she said it warmly like she was sharing a fond memory, which is exactly why nobody at that table stepped in. I felt it in my body before I understood it in my head, a hot pressure behind my eyes, my hand closing around the stem of my own wine glass so tight I was afraid it would snap. I didn't cry. I didn't argue. I did the thing I'd done my whole life, which was absorb it, smile, and reach for the nearest ornament on the mantel behind me like it was a life raft. The secondary cruelty came about 10 minutes later, quieter and somehow worse, when my mother turned to my husband and said sweetly that she hoped he had enough patience for 2, implying, in front of his own in-laws, that keeping me afloat was a burden he was generously absorbing. My husband's jaw tightened. He didn't say anything either. None of us did. That's the part that still gets me, if I'm honest, not what she said, but the 11 people who let it sit there in the air and did nothing. Then came the silence. It lasted maybe 4 full seconds, but I have never in my life experienced 4 seconds that long, the candle hissing slightly where wax had pooled near the wick, someone's ice settling in their glass, my mother's eyes on me, waiting to see whether I'd finally crack in front of an audience the way she'd apparently been hoping I would for years. I didn't crack. I excused myself to the kitchen instead, ostensibly to check on the pie, and I stood there with both hands flat on the cold counter, breathing, while I heard the conversation pick back up behind me like nothing had happened, my mother's laugh threading through it, easy and light. When I came back out 20 minutes later, composed, pie in hand, nobody apologized. Nobody even looked uncomfortable. My mother thanked me for the pie in the same breath she reminded Petra that the car service was picking her up for the club spa at 9 the next morning. A car service I now understood with total clarity that I was personally still paying for. I left that night without saying goodbye to my mother directly. I hugged my husband's arm the whole walk to the car, and somewhere between her front steps and our driveway, standing in freshly falling snow with that tin star still in my coat pocket, I made the first real decision of the whole ordeal. I was going to go home, open my father's trust documents for the first time in years, and actually read every word of Article 7. The tin star, if you're wondering, wasn't even mine originally. It was one of maybe 40 identical ornaments my mother had bought in bulk decades ago and handed out to whichever grandchild helped decorate, and she'd always called it the cheap one, the one she'd sooner throw away than admit she still used. I'd been holding the cheap one the whole time she called me worthless. There's a joke in there somewhere, and eventually I was able to laugh at it, though not that night. I didn't sleep. I sat at my kitchen table at 1 a.m. with a banker's box of my father's old paperwork open in front of me, and I read the trust documents start to finish for the first time in probably 3 years. Article 7, Section 3, sat exactly where I remembered it. Full trustee discretion, no requirement for consent from any beneficiary, no obligation to explain a reduction or termination of payments. My father's handwriting was in the margin of one page, a note to himself from years earlier. Protect W, she won't ask for this, so make sure she has it anyway. I sat with that for a long time. The next morning I called Nathaniel Cho and asked him to send me every disbursement record from the trust for the past 3 years, not the summary reports Theo usually forwarded, the actual line item statements. He hesitated on the phone in a way he never had before, and told me it would take a few days to pull together, which struck me as strange, because Nathaniel had emailed me full statements within the hour on every previous occasion I'd asked. 4 days later, an envelope arrived instead of an email, thick, unmarked except for my name, no return address I recognized. Inside were photocopies of invoices I had never approved, recurring monthly charges of $1,100 each, labeled Property Management Services, Aldermere Unit, going back nearly 2 years, paid out of the trust to a company I'd never heard of called Ridgeline Facilities Group. I sat with that envelope for a full day before I did anything else, because my first instinct, and I want to be honest about this, was that I'd made some mistake, that there was a boring explanation, that Ridgeline was a real vendor Theo had simply forgotten to loop me in on. I actually called the number listed on the invoices, ready to apologize for bothering them. The number rang 11 times and disconnected. I tried again the next morning and got the same result. There was no boring explanation waiting for me. There was just a phone number that rang into nothing. My first real lead, if I can call it that, turned out to be a dead end, and I want to tell you about it honestly because it wasted 3 days I didn't have to spare. I found a name on an old email chain, a Karen Sally's, listed as a regional coordinator for a facilities company, and I spent 3 days convinced she was the key to the whole thing, tracking down a possible address, drafting an email I never sent. It turned out Karen Sally's worked for an entirely unrelated company 2 states away that had nothing to do with any of this. Her name had simply appeared in a forwarded chain by coincidence, CC'd on something unrelated years earlier. I felt foolish. I also felt oddly more determined, because now I knew the real answer wasn't going to be handed to me easily. I called an elder law and trust attorney a former colleague had recommended years earlier and never needed, a woman named Corrine Ape, who listened to the whole story over the phone without once softening her voice with sympathy, which strangely was exactly what I needed. She asked me 3 questions: who signed off on vendor onboarding, who had check writing authority, and whether the trust required dual signatures for amounts over a certain threshold. And by the 3rd question I already knew from the sound of my own answers that I wasn't imagining any of this. Corrine pulled Ridgeline Facilities Group's state filing records within 2 days. The registered agent on the LLC was a name I recognized instantly. My brother's wife's maiden name, filed 18 months earlier, 3 months after Theo had taken over helping Mom with the household paperwork. Reading that filing out loud to my husband at our kitchen table, I actually laughed, one short, disbelieving bark of a laugh, because it was such a lazy alias that a 5-minute public records search cracked it, and my brother had always considered himself the clever one in the family. The pressure started almost immediately after I quietly asked Nathaniel Cho in writing to explain the Ridgeline invoices. The first voicemail came from my mother. 2 days later, her voice pitched somewhere between wounded and imperious. "Winifred, it's your mother. Theo tells me you've been asking strange questions about the household accounts, and frankly, after everything this family has done for you, I find the timing insulting. Call me back before you embarrass yourself further." The second came the next evening from Theo himself, his tone friendlier but tighter, the kind of friendly that has teeth in it. "Hey, Win, it's Theo. Look, whatever you think you found, there's a totally normal explanation, and honestly it's a little hurtful you'd go around us instead of just asking me directly. Call me before this gets weird, okay?" The third arrived by text 3 days after that from my mother again, shorter and colder. "I've spoken to my attorney. You are not to contact Ridgeline Nathaniel or anyone else regarding my finances again." The second betrayal came from a place I genuinely hadn't braced for. My cousin Delphine, no, not her. It was actually my sister-in-law's own mother, a woman I'd always considered gentle, who called me not to comfort me but to relay, almost apologetically, that the family had decided among themselves that I was having some kind of episode, and that it would be kinder for everyone if I just let the household finances go back to Theo where they belonged. I sat with the phone against my ear for a long moment after she hung up, understanding for the first time just how many people had quietly agreed behind my back on a story about me before I'd said a single word in my own defense. The institutional piece landed a week later, when Corrine obtained Nathaniel Cho's full email history with Theo through a formal records request tied to the trust's own governing documents, which gave beneficiaries certain inspection rights I hadn't known I had. Buried in that history was an email from Nathaniel to Theo, 11 months old, that read in part, "I can keep routing the Ridgeline payments as management fees as long as Winifred doesn't request itemized statements. She never has before." He hadn't been tricked into anything. He'd been an active, willing participant, quietly betting that I'd never bother to look. There's something almost darkly comic about being underestimated, that specifically not dismissed as incompetent, just dismissed as too polite to check. I sat in Corrine's office reading that sentence and actually said out loud, "Well, I suppose I should thank him for the vote of confidence." And Corrine, who had not smiled once in 3 meetings, allowed herself a small, tired laugh at that. The voice in my head that had spent 30 years telling me to keep the peace finally said something different, sitting in that office. This isn't about being right in front of them. It's about making sure it never happens to anyone else at that table the way it happened to me. I want to say clearly, because some of you watching have lived something like this. If you've ever felt smaller in a room full of people who were supposed to love you, I understand exactly where that feeling lies. 2 weeks before I acted, Corrine finished tracing the total. Over the 18 months Ridgeline had existed, Theo and Nathaniel had diverted just under $91,000 out of my father's trust into an account controlled by my brother's wife, on top of the $14,200 a month already flowing legitimately to my mother's lifestyle. Corrine looked at me across her desk and said flatly, "You have full discretion. You could end this today." I didn't end it that day. I wanted one more piece. The recovered evidence itself, something undeniable, sitting in a folder Theo had tucked into our father's old filing cabinet at my mother's condo and labeled, almost too on the nose, "Duart household, do not open." Getting to that folder meant one afternoon, 3 weeks before New Year's, when my mother asked me to come help her sort through Christmas decorations she wanted taken down. An olive branch of sorts, or so I let her believe I thought it was. While she napped in the next room, I opened the cabinet Theo had specifically told her never to let anyone touch, because Dad's old paperwork is a mess in there, and found, behind 2 decoys of genuinely boring old warranty documents, the original signed Ridgeline vendor agreement, Theo's signature, notarized, dated the same week he'd taken over the household paperwork, along with a handwritten note in his own hand estimating, in round numbers, what he thought he could reasonably pull before anyone noticed. I photographed every page with my phone, my hands not quite steady, and put the folder back exactly as I'd found it before my mother woke from her nap. I chose the same dining room for what came next, the same table, the same mantel, though this time it was New Year's Eve instead of Christmas, which felt right somehow, an ending instead of the usual beginning. I'd asked Corrine to be there in a professional capacity, framed to my mother as helping sort out some year-end trust paperwork, which wasn't exactly a lie. Desmond Okafor, my husband's brother-in-law, was there too, the way he always was for family gatherings, standing near the kitchen doorway with a drink he never finished, exactly as he had at Christmas, a steady, unemotional presence who noticed everything and said almost nothing, which is precisely why I'd quietly asked him beforehand simply to be present and pay attention. I started calmly. I told my mother in front of Theo that I'd reviewed the trust's disbursement history in full detail. She waved a hand, already bored, already certain this would go the way every previous conversation between us had gone. I said the number out loud, $91,000, and watched Theo's face go very still. My mother laughed, actually laughed, and said I must be confused about how the accounts worked, that I'd always been confused about money. I said the number again, this time with the Ridgeline agreement in my hand. Theo's own signature turned toward the room. The laughing stopped. Theo tried one last thing, his voice climbing, insisting it was a loan structure. He'd fully intended to disclose eventually that I was making something ugly out of what was, in his telling, a simple family arrangement between people who trusted each other. Corrine answered him directly, without raising her voice at all. Notarized vendor agreements aren't loan structures, and neither is a shell company registered under his wife's maiden name specifically to avoid the trust's own conflict of interest disclosure requirements. It wasn't clean. My mother, cornered, pivoted instantly to me instead of Theo, her voice cracking in a way I'd genuinely never heard before, insisting that whatever Theo had or hadn't done, I owed her the lifestyle regardless, that a daughter simply does this for her mother, full stop, no accounting required. For one unsteady second, standing in that room, some old, exhausted part of me almost agreed with her out loud. Corrine's line landed a moment later, quiet and exact. That under the terms my father himself had written, discretion had never actually belonged to anyone but me, and every dollar that had gone out for 6 years had been a choice, freely made, not an obligation anyone was owed. Theo's own wife, standing near the hallway, said only 4 words, "I told you, Theo," and looked away, and something in Theo's shoulders finally dropped, the fight going out of him in real time. I delivered the terms once cleanly. The discretionary distributions to my mother's household would be reduced immediately to a fixed, modest monthly amount covering housing and basic care, permanently. The Ridgeline arrangement would be reported to the trust's oversight attorney and, separately, to the state licensing board overseeing Nathaniel's practice, and Theo would have no further access to any trust paperwork ever again. As I said it, I reached into my coat pocket without entirely planning to and set the tin star down on that same mantel, in the same spot it had sat on Christmas, and this time nobody in the room mistook what it meant, not a cheap ornament anymore, but the one thing in that house that had always, quietly, been mine to give or take away. I walked out through the same front door I'd walked out of on Christmas, my husband's hand in mine, into cold air that didn't feel nearly as sharp as it had 3 weeks earlier, and I didn't look back at the house before we reached the car. Nathaniel Cho lost his license within 4 months, after the state board's review confirmed a pattern going back further than even Ridgeline, smaller, older discrepancies he'd apparently gotten comfortable with over a decade of nobody ever asking to see the itemized numbers. Theo, separately, was removed as a cosigner on every remaining piece of family paperwork, and after Corrine's formal complaint, spent most of the following year dealing with a civil claim from the trust itself, seeking repayment of the diverted funds with interest. What I lost isn't the kind of thing you can put a dollar figure on, and I want to be honest with you about that instead of pretending this ended tidy. I lost whatever small, stubborn hope I'd still been carrying that my mother would one day simply be proud of me without an audience forcing her hand. That hope didn't die loudly. It just quietly stopped showing up, the way a guest you'd stopped expecting simply stops being missed. So maybe the real question was never whether I'd finally stand up for myself in that dining room. Maybe it was always whether I'd finally stop waiting for permission I was never going to get. Here's something I think about now more than I expected to. For years I assumed the people closest to us are the ones who see us most clearly, and I've come to believe the opposite is often true. The people closest to us have usually decided who we are so long ago that they stop looking. If you were sitting where I was standing that Christmas, holding whatever your version of that tin star is, would you have quietly walked away, or would you have said something out loud right there at the table in front of everyone? I'll leave you with one more question, a different one, because I think it matters just as much as anything I told you tonight. How do you decide when loyalty to a person stops being a virtue and starts being a debt you never actually agreed to carry? This story is a work of fiction, inspired by the kinds of quiet financial and emotional imbalances many families carry without ever naming them out loud. If any part of tonight's story landed close to something in your own life, I hope it gave you something useful to sit with, even if just for a little while. Thank you for spending this time with me. I'll see you in the next one.